Something's out there. I hear it. He's moving slow. Be ready.
The storm came without warning. One moment the sky over the Montana Pass was pale gray, the kind of cold afternoon light that sits low and flat in late October. The next the wind shifted hard from the northwest, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a breath. The horses felt it before the passengers did. The lead pair began pulling against their harness, ears flat, hooves finding less purchase on the muddy trail as the first sheets of rain came sideways off the mountain. Clara Ashwood was sitting on the left side of the coach, third seat back, with a worn leather satchel pressed between her knees and a book she had not opened in 2 hours sitting face down on her lap. She was not reading. She had not been reading since they crossed the last ridge and the trail began its descent into the valley. She had been watching the land instead, the way it opened up beneath the mountains, vast and brown and indifferent, and thinking about what it meant to start over in a place that did not know your name. She was 28 years old. She had a teaching certificate from the state of Ohio, one trunk of belongings strapped to the top of the coach, and a letter of employment from the Harlow Creek School Board that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She also had a reason for leaving Columbus that she did not intend to share with anyone in Montana, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep but from carrying something heavy for too long. The man beside her was heavy-set, with a thick brown mustache and a pocket watch he checked every few minutes as though it might tell him something different than it had before. Across from her sat a woman in a green traveling coat holding a small boy of perhaps 7 on her lap. The boy had fallen asleep an hour ago and had not stirred since. At the far end of the bench, pressed against the opposite door, a thin older man with wire-rimmed glasses read a newspaper with the focused intensity of someone trying very hard not to think about the road. Then the wheel hit something. Clara never knew exactly what it was. The driver said later it was a rock pushed into the rut by the flooding, but it did not matter in the moment because in the moment there was only the sound, a crack like a rifle shot, and then the sudden terrible tilt of the world. The coach went left. Hard and fast and without negotiation. Clara's hand caught the window frame and held for half a second before the momentum took her, and then she was weightless, and then she was not, and then there was pain in her shoulder and darkness, and the sound of wood splintering and a woman screaming and the high frantic whinny of a horse in distress. Silence, not complete silence, rain on wood, wind through broken glass, somewhere the sound of a wheel still spinning on its axle, slowing, the boy crying softly the way children cry when they are frightened but not badly hurt. Clara opened her eyes. She was on her side. The coach had landed on its left side and she was pressed against what had been the door, now a floor, with the man with the mustache half on top of her, and the older man with the glasses wedged against the opposite wall, which was now the ceiling. The woman in the green coat was sitting up already, pulling the boy close, running her hands over his face and arms, checking. Clara moved her fingers first, then her wrists. Then she pushed herself up onto her elbow and waited for the pain to tell her something useful. Her shoulder throbbed where it had hit the frame. Her ribs ached on the left side. Nothing felt broken. She had been lucky in the specific way that people are lucky when things go very wrong, but not as wrong as they could have. The man with the mustache groaned and rolled off her, sitting up in the cramped space with his hat over his eyes. "Someone needs to open the door above us," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The older man with the glasses was already trying. He had gotten to his feet somehow in the awkward sideways space and was pushing up at the right side door with both hands, grunting with the effort. Clara got up beside him. Together they shoved. The door gave with a grinding complaint and rain poured in immediately, cold and sharp and tasting of pine. The man climbed out first, then reached down for the boy. The woman in the green coat handed him up and then climbed out herself. The man with the mustache went next. Clara waited, not because she was being polite, but because something made her pause, some instinct she could not have named, and in that pause she heard something outside the coach. Footsteps, deliberate, unhurried. She climbed out into the rain. The pass was narrow here, the trail carved into the side of the mountain with a rock face on one side and a slope dropping steeply away on the other. The coach lay on its side in the mud, one wheel still turning slowly above her head. The horses had been cut loose somehow or had broken free and stood 30 yards up the trail, steam rising off their backs, stamping and blowing. The driver sat against the rock face, holding a cloth to his forehead, blood darkening the cloth. He was conscious. His eyes tracked her as she climbed down from the overturned coach, and standing in the rain, 10 feet from the wreckage, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall. Not in the obvious way of men who carry their height like a performance, but in the quiet, functional way of someone built for work in open country. He wore a dark coat, long, with the collar turned up against the rain, and a wide-brimmed hat that threw his face into shadow. He was already moving when Clara looked at him, moving toward the horses with the calm efficiency of someone who had assessed the situation while she was still climbing out of the wreck and had decided what needed doing first. He caught the lead horse by the bridle, spoke to it in a voice too low to hear. The horse stopped pulling against nothing and stood. The other passengers were gathering themselves. The woman in the green coat had the boy wrapped in her coat now. The older man was trying to assess the damage to the coach with the helpless optimism of someone who does not know what he is looking at. The man with the mustache had found his hat and put it on, which seemed to have restored some portion of his dignity. The man in the dark coat came back from the horses and went to the driver without being asked. He crouched beside him, examined the cut on his forehead with 2 fingers, said something brief and quiet. The driver nodded. The man stood and turned to the rest of them. "Anyone seriously hurt?" he said. It was not quite a question. His voice was low and rough-edged, the kind of voice that had spent years outdoors and had not been softened by indoor living. The woman shook her head. The older man said he thought his wrist was sprained. The boy had stopped crying. The man nodded once. Then his gaze moved across the group and stopped on Clara. She had a scrape on her cheek she had not noticed until that moment, could feel it now because his eyes went to it briefly before coming back to hers. His eyes were pale gray or light blue, difficult to tell in the rain and the fading afternoon light. His face was weathered, lined at the corners of the eyes and along the jaw where a faint scar ran from just below his ear to the edge of his chin. He looked like a man who had been outside in all kinds of weather for a long time and had stopped expecting it to be otherwise. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Not 2, not 4, 3. She counted them without meaning to, and in those 3 seconds she had the distinct sensation of being seen very clearly by someone who was very good at seeing and who had already made several accurate observations about her that she was not yet aware of. Then he looked away. "Town is 2 miles north," he said to the group. "Trail's going to wash out in another hour. You need to move." "What about the coach?" the driver asked. "Leave it. Send someone back when the weather breaks." The driver muttered but did not argue. The man in the dark coat turned back to the horses. He was done talking, apparently. Done with them. Clara watched him check the second horse's left foreleg, running his hand down the cannon bone with practiced attention, and she had the peculiar feeling that he had already decided they were going to be fine and had moved on to the next problem. She should have followed the others. They were already starting up the trail, the woman with the boy leading, the older man behind her, the man with the mustache helping the driver to his feet. The rain was getting worse. Her dress was soaked through and her boots were sinking in the mud with every step, and the sensible thing, the only sensible thing, was to walk 2 miles north to Harlow Creek and get warm and dry and figure out the rest from there. She walked over to where he was standing with the horse. "Thank you," she said. "For the horses, for knowing what to do." He glanced at her. Not unfriendly, not particularly friendly either. "You helped with the door," he said. "That's more than most." He turned back to the horse. Clara stood for a moment in the rain, aware that she was being dismissed without being insulted, which was a particular skill that not everyone possessed. "Do you live near here?" she asked. "Close enough. Will you be all right in this storm?" He looked at her again, and this time there was something in his expression she could not immediately read. Not surprise exactly, something more like the careful attention of a man who has learned to notice things that might matter later. "I'll manage," he said. "You should get moving." She went, caught up with the others and did not look back, which required a small but definite act of will that she noticed and filed away without examining too closely. The walk to Harlow Creek took 40 minutes in the driving rain and felt considerably longer. By the time the first buildings came into view through the gray curtain of the storm, Clara's boots were destroyed, her hair was plastered flat against her face, and the scrape on her cheek had stiffened in the cold. The town was smaller than she had imagined from the school board's letter, a single main street of wooden buildings with covered boardwalks, a church at the north end, a livery stable at the south, and between them the general store, a bank, a doctor's office, the post office, and a saloon whose windows threw yellow light into the darkening afternoon like something warm seen from a distance. The driver led them to the saloon. A heavy-set woman with iron-gray hair and the composed authority of someone who has managed crises before looked them over once, took stock, and began giving orders. Coffee appeared. Blankets were produced from somewhere. The woman with the boy was taken to a back room. The driver sat down and allowed someone to look at his head. The older man's wrist was wrapped. The man with the mustache found a whiskey and a chair and seemed to believe the worst was over. Clara sat near the wood stove and wrapped both hands around a tin cup of coffee and let herself be warm. She was still sitting there, starting to feel something like herself again, when the man appeared at her elbow. He was perhaps 50, trim, with a neat gray beard and the kind of expensive coat that looks deliberately understated rather than accidentally so. He had a way of standing that suggested he was accustomed to rooms adjusting themselves around him rather than the other way around. "Miss Ashwood," he said and smiled. "I'm Edmund Voss. I own the general store here in Harlow Creek, among other things. We've been expecting you. I'm sorry your arrival was so unpleasant." Clara looked at him. Something small and precise moved through her, not quite alarm, just the registering of a detail. She had not told anyone in the saloon her name. "I wasn't aware anyone was expecting me specifically," she said carefully. Voss smiled again. "Small town, Miss Ashwood. Word travels. The school board wrote to tell us the new teacher would be arriving this week. When the stage came in short a coach and full of bedraggled passengers, it wasn't difficult to identify you as the one with the teacher's satchel. It was a reasonable explanation. It sat slightly wrong, the way a picture hung not quite level sits wrong, but she could not have pointed to the exact degree of error. She let it go. She was tired and wet, and she had 2 miles of mud still in her boots. Voss arranged everything. A room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Aldridge 2 doors down, a promise to show her the schoolhouse in the morning. An introduction to Sheriff Dalton Hare, who appeared at Voss's side with the smooth timing of someone who had been waiting just outside her field of vision. Hare was lean and angular, with a badge that caught the lamplight and hands that never quite stopped moving, adjusting his belt, touching the brim of his hat, tapping 2 fingers against his thigh. "Miss Ashwood," Hare said. "Terrible business with the coach. Glad you made it in safe. Thank you, Sheriff. You need anything while you're settling in, anything at all, my office is right across the street." Harlow Creek takes care of its own. It was the second time someone had said something very like that to her in the last 10 minutes. She noticed it the same way she had noticed Voss knowing her name. Set it beside the first thing, moved on. The boarding house was clean and quiet. Her room was on the 2nd floor with a window that looked east over the rooftops toward the open land beyond town. She peeled off her wet things and washed her face in the basin and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened to the rain against the glass and tried to organize her thoughts. She had come here to start over. That was the plain fact of it, stripped of the softer language she had used in the letters to her sister and in the stories she told herself on the long journey west. She had been a teacher in Columbus, well regarded, with a position she had held for 4 years and a life that looked from the outside like the kind of life a sensible young woman was supposed to want. And then her younger sister had made a serious mistake, the kind of mistake that in 1883 Ohio could ruin not just the person who made it but everyone connected to her. And Clara had done what she thought needed doing, which was step in front of it. She had told a partial truth to the school board that allowed her sister's name to stay out of the matter entirely, and had absorbed the professional consequences herself. It had cost her the Columbus position and her reputation in 3 counties, and the careful distance of people who had once called themselves her friends. She did not regret it, but she was tired of carrying it alone. She had not told any of this to the Harlow Creek School Board. She had presented her certificate, her references from the years before the incident, and a letter explaining her desire for a change of scenery. The board had been short a teacher for 6 months. They had hired her by return post. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and thought about the man in the rain, the way he had looked at her for 3 seconds and then looked away, the way he had known exactly what needed doing without asking anyone's permission or waiting to be thanked. She slept before she could finish the thought. Morning in Harlow Creek was cold and blue and very still after the storm. Clara dressed in her spare dress, a plain dark gray that she had packed specifically because it read as serious without being severe, and pinned her hair and went down to breakfast. The dining room of the boarding house had 4 tables. She was the only one at hers. Mrs. Aldridge brought eggs and biscuits without asking and poured coffee with the efficiency of someone who views unnecessary conversation as a form of waste. Clara ate and listened to the 2 men at the far table talking. The first thing she heard clearly was a name. Ryder Callahan, the nearer man said, low enough that he clearly thought he was keeping it between them. Saw him at the feed store yesterday, didn't say a word to anyone. The second man shrugged. Never does. Heard he was out at the pass last night. Pulled some people out of a wrecked coach. That sounds about right for him. Shows up, does what needs doing, disappears. You think he'll ever sell to Voss? The second man was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Callahan? No. That man would rather burn than sell to Voss, and everyone in this county knows it. Voss included. Then things are going to get worse out there. They already are, the second man said. They already are. Clara kept her eyes on her plate and finished her breakfast. She spent the morning at the schoolhouse. Voss had offered to meet her there at 9, and he arrived precisely on time, which she noted as its own kind of data point. The building was a single room at the east end of town, small but structurally sound, with a wood stove, a chalkboard, and 24 desks in various states of repair. It smelled of dust and chalk and coal. Voss walked her through it with the proprietary satisfaction of a man showing off something he owns that he is graciously allowing someone else to use. He explained the school board's expectations, introduced her to 2 parents who happened by, pointed out which families were the most influential in the district. He did all of this smoothly and warmly, with a generous attentiveness that would have been entirely convincing if she had not already been watching him with some care. "We've been without a teacher for 6 months, he said. "The children are behind. I know you'll get them caught up quickly." He paused at the door. "Oh, and I wanted to mention something. An opportunity. I've been thinking about building a proper school. 2 rooms, a real library. Something the district can be genuinely proud of. I'd need the right person to run it. Someone the community respects." His eyes settled on her with the practiced precision of a man who has made many offers and knows exactly how they land. "I'd like you to consider it." Clara smiled without committing anything. "That's very generous," she said. "I'll focus on getting to know the students first, if you don't mind." We can talk about larger plans once I understand what's needed. Voss nodded as though this was exactly what he had expected her to say and had already accounted for it. Of course, he said. No rush at all. Della Hartmore came by the schoolhouse that afternoon while Clara was cleaning. She was a woman of perhaps 35, with a direct face and the kind of tired eyes that belong to people who have been paying attention to something worrying for a long time. She brought a pot of soup and set it on the teacher's desk without ceremony. Heard you came in on the wrecked coach, Della said. Thought you might not have had a proper meal yet. That's very kind. Della sat down in one of the student chairs and looked at her levelly. You met Voss? Yes. And Hare? Yes. Della nodded slowly as though confirming something she had already believed. Voss is going to be helpful, she said. Very helpful. Arrangements, introductions, opportunities. He's been doing it for years with everyone who comes through. Her voice was even and factual. Just make sure you understand what helpful cost before you let him get too far into the habit of it. Clara set down her cleaning cloth. What does it cost? Della looked at the window for a moment. My husband worked for Voss for 3 years. Decent pay, reliable hours, treated fairly right up until he wasn't. Until Voss needed something that my husband couldn't give him without crossing a line. Then Voss called in everything he owed at once. She paused. We're still paying that debt, one way or another. She stood and picked up the empty pot. I'm not saying don't be polite to the man, she said. I'm saying know what you're agreeing to before you agree. That's all. Welcome to Harlow Creek, Miss Ashwood. She left. Clara stood alone in the quiet schoolhouse and looked at the chalkboard and thought about the shape of what she had walked into, the way it was becoming clearer around the edges without yet being fully visible. The next 3 days passed in the rhythm of a new place, slowly becoming familiar. She learned the children's names quickly, all 14 of them, ranging from 6-year-old Josie Crane, who had just learned to write her name and did it at every opportunity, to 13-year-old Walter Fitch, who read 2 grades ahead and tried to hide it by slouching. She learned the layout of the town, which buildings mattered, and who ran them. She had coffee twice with Cutter Foss, the bartender at the Silver Rail Saloon, who had the specific kind of casual intelligence that comes from years of listening to people talk when they think no one is particularly paying attention. Cutter was perhaps 40, lean and watchful, with scarred knuckles and a dry humor he deployed sparingly enough that it always landed. He had been in Harlow Creek for 8 years and knew everything about everyone and said very little of it unprompted. But on the second morning when Clara came in for coffee before school, he set her cup down and said, without preamble, don't sign anything Voss gives you, not without reading it twice and then waiting a day. She thanked him. He nodded and went back to wiping down the bar. She saw Ryder Callahan twice in those first days, once from a distance, outside the livery stable talking to the blacksmith about something involving his horse's hoof. Once across the main street, coming out of the feed store with a sack over one shoulder, moving with the same unhurried efficiency she had noticed in the rain. Both times she had the sense that he was aware of her before she was aware of him, and both times he left before there was any occasion for conversation. The town gave him space. Not the dramatic visible avoidance of someone actively feared, but something subtler, a slight adjustment of trajectory, a degree of extra distance, the way people unconsciously route around something they cannot categorize. She noticed it the first time she saw him in town and could not decide, in the days that followed, whether the distance was something Ryder had cultivated deliberately or something Voss had arranged. She was beginning to suspect it was the latter. On the 5th day, a Thursday, she went east. She needed air. She had been inside the schoolhouse or the boarding house or the saloon for 5 days straight, and the walls were beginning to feel specific in the way walls do when you have been somewhere long enough to know their dimensions. She followed the trail out past the eastern edge of town, where the last building gave way to open grassland rolling down toward a line of cottonwood trees along what she had been told was Harlow Creek proper, the actual body of water the town was named for. She walked until the town was behind her, and the only sound was wind through the dry grass and her own footsteps. That was when she saw him. Ryder Callahan was 50 yards away, working on a section of fence line where 2 posts had gone down in the storm. He had his coat off despite the cold, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he was resetting the near post with a methodical attention that suggested he had done it many times and did not require thinking about. He had not seen her yet. She should have turned around. She knew that with the same clarity with which she knew her multiplication tables and the rules of grammar and various other things she had learned and kept. There was no sensible reason to walk toward a man who had shown no particular interest in being approached, and every indication of preferring solitude. She walked toward him anyway. He noticed her when she was perhaps 20 feet away. He straightened without hurrying, set down the post driver, and watched her come the rest of the way. He watched her come without shifting his weight or adjusting his expression, simply present in the way certain people are present, who have stopped performing calm and simply have it. Mr. Callahan, she said. Miss Ashwood, he said. His voice carried the same quality it had had in the storm, low measured, with the slight roughness of someone who did not use it excessively. She stopped at a conversational distance and looked at the fence he had been working on. How did you know my name? She asked. We haven't been introduced. He looked at her steadily. Small town. People keep saying that to me, she said. It seems to cover a wide range of situations. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. He considered for a moment. Then he said, Voss knows your name. Voss talks to Hare. Between them, they know everything that comes into this town before it arrives. He paused. I make it my business to know what they know when I can. Clara turned that over carefully. You were watching for me specifically, she said. Not you specifically. Anyone new who came in that Voss took an interest in. He went back to the post, adjusting it slightly in the ground and checking the vertical with his eye. Voss always has a reason when he takes an interest in someone. It's worth knowing what the reason is before they do, and what's his reason for me. Ryder looked at her then, directly, the same way he had in the rain. You're educated, he said. You're from outside. You don't owe him anything yet. That makes you useful as a witness to things he wants witnessed or as a character reference for decisions he wants to seem legitimate. He gets one or the other out of most people who come through. Sometimes both. Clara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. The offer about the new school, she said. He said nothing. He did not need to. The silence confirmed it completely. She looked out across the grassland toward the mountains. The light was going flat in the late afternoon, the way it did out here an hour or two before dark, turning everything the same muted gold. The accident at the pass, she said. She said it carefully, watching his face. Sheriff Hare was there. Ryder went very still. He was there before it was reported, she continued. I noticed it at the time that he arrived too fast. I didn't understand it then, but he was there before we had sent anyone for help. Ryder was quiet. The wind moved through the grass around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, but something underneath it had changed. When was the last time you were somewhere that felt genuinely safe? He said. The question surprised her enough that she answered it honestly. Ohio, she said. 4 years ago. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Go back to town, he said. Don't tell anyone you came out here. Don't tell anyone we talked. She studied him. Are you warning me? He picked up his coat from the fence post and put it on. I'm asking you to be careful, he said. There's a difference. She walked back to Harlow Creek, slowly, turning everything over. The wind was picking up behind her, pushing from the north, carrying the smell of more rain. She thought about Hare at the pass. She thought about Voss with her name already on his lips. She thought about Ryder's stillness when she had mentioned it. The stillness of someone hearing a suspicion confirmed that they had been carrying alone for a long time. By the time she reached the edge of town, the light had gone gray and the first drops of the evening rain had begun to fall. Voss's dinner invitation arrived the following morning, a handwritten note delivered to the schoolhouse just after the children had settled into their seats. A small gathering, it said. Saturday evening. The most prominent members of our little community. I do hope you'll join us. Della's words moved through her. Know what you're agreeing to before you agree. She wrote back that she would be delighted to attend. Saturday came cold and clear, the sky washed pale blue after 2 days of rain. Clara dressed with deliberate simplicity, the dark blue dress, her hair pinned straight, nothing that could be read as trying too hard in either direction. She walked to Voss's house on the north end of town, which was exactly as large and well appointed as she had expected. 2 stories, painted white, with a wide porch and lamps burning in every window. Hare was already there when she arrived, standing near the fireplace with a glass in his hand. The banker, a man named Aldous Prentice, sat across from him, watching the room with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for opportunities to present themselves. A couple named Whitfield ran the town's only hotel, and they sat together at one end of the dining table. At the other end, Voss's sister, a sharp-eyed woman named Constance, watched Clara come in with the focused attention of someone conducting an assessment they have been looking forward to. Dinner was roast beef and good wine, an easy conversation that moved from topic to topic with the practiced fluency of people who have had this kind of dinner many times and know where all the comfortable ground is. Clara listened more than she spoke. She answered questions when asked, said nothing that committed her to anything, and watched the room. Voss waited until the dessert course. I've been giving more thought to the school expansion, he said, setting down his fork. I want to be frank with you, Miss Ashwood. I've heard very good things about your work this week. The parents are impressed. The children are responding well. He smiled in the way of someone who knows he is about to make an offer you will find difficult to refuse. I'd like to discuss moving forward more quickly on the new building. 2 full rooms, a library, a proper teacher's house on the property. Clara met his eyes. That's a significant commitment. Harlow Creek is growing. We need to grow with it. He glanced around the table, gathering the room with a look, and we need the right person to lead that growth. Someone the community already trusts. There it was, the hook, precise and smooth, almost invisible. I'm very flattered, she said, and I'm genuinely interested in what that could mean for the students. I'd need to understand the details of the arrangement before I could give you an answer. Of course, Voss said warmly. No rush at all. Take all the time you need. But his eyes said something else entirely. They said he had done this before, many times, and that he was already certain of the outcome, and that the space between this moment and her agreement was a formality he was willing to observe out of courtesy. She thanked him for dinner and left when she reasonably could. The night air was cold and sharp after the warmth of Voss's dining room. She walked back along the main street, her mind moving through what had been said and, more importantly, what had not been said, the machinery behind the offer that she had not yet been shown. She was thinking so hard she almost did not see the figure leaning against the side wall of the silver rail until she was nearly past it. Rough evening, she stopped. Her heart moved fast for a moment, and then she recognized the voice, and it steadied. Ryder Callahan stepped out of the shadow of the building. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, direct and measuring, though there was something else in it tonight. "You were watching the house," she said, "keeping an eye on things. You could have told me you were going to do that. I didn't know you were going until this afternoon." He paused. "What did he offer you?" she told him. "The school, the house, the salary." He listened without interrupting, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes steady on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He offered me a similar arrangement 3 years ago," he said. "My land for a partnership stake in his lumber operation. Fair price, reasonable terms, nothing in writing that could be called coercive." He paused. "I've watched him do it to 7 other people in this county since I've been here. By the time they understand what they've actually agreed to, they're in it so deep that getting out costs more than they can afford to pay." "What did you do when he offered you the deal?" Ryder looked at her, said no, and then what happened? He smiled, not warmly. Then things started happening. Clara looked at him. Standing in the dark outside the saloon, his face half lit by the lamp above the door, he looked like exactly what she suspected he was. A man who had made a decision to stand his ground and was paying the full price of it, and had not yet decided whether the price was too high. "He's going to use me," she said. "One way or another. That's his plan. So what do I do?" Ryder was quiet. The lamp above the door swung slightly in the wind. "You could leave," he said, "before it gets complicated. Take a position somewhere else. He'd let you go. You haven't seen enough yet to be a problem." "I'm not leaving." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, something she did not have an immediate name for, but recognized as the thing you see in a person's face when they have revised an estimate upward. "Then be careful," he said, "about what you agree to, about what you say and to whom. About what you let him think he can expect from you." "Everyone keeps telling me to be careful," she said, "you included. But careful isn't a plan. It's just a way of waiting for something to happen." Ryder said nothing. "What is he actually after?" she asked. "Not the school, not the land deals, the real thing underneath all of it." Ryder looked east toward the dark edge of town and the open land beyond it. The wind moved. "There's a water source on my property," he said. "Only reliable year-round water access for 50 miles in any direction. Whoever controls that water controls how this entire valley develops. Voss has been building toward owning this valley for 10 years. My land is the last piece he doesn't have. And you won't sell, no, even though not selling is costing you." He looked back at her. Yes, she looked at him. At the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes and something she was only beginning to understand, the quality of a man who has made a decision he is going to have to keep making every single day and knows it and has not yet flinched. "Good night, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Miss Ashwood." She went inside. She lay in bed for a long time listening to the wind and thinking about water rights and the shapes that power takes when it has had enough time to arrange itself, and about a man who was standing alone against something much larger than himself because he believed the ground he stood on was worth standing on. And then near midnight, without warning, she heard the shot. A single crack from the east, carrying flat and sharp across the still night air, unmistakable and cold. She was at the window before she was fully awake. The street below was empty. The town was dark. She pressed her face to the glass and looked east, toward the open land beyond the last building, toward the cottonwood trees she could just make out against the dark sky, toward the trail that wound out to Ryder Callahan's property 2 miles away. She stood there for a long time. Nothing moved. In the morning, the whole town knew. A man had been found dead before first light, lying in the mud at the gate of Ryder Callahan's property. Sheriff Hare had arrived on the scene at dawn, he said, having heard the shot from the office where he had been working late. Clara stood at the edge of the small crowd that gathered near the edge of town, listening to Hare explain this, and felt something settle into place with a terrible clarity. The sheriff's office was on the west side of the main street. The shot had come from the east. The distance was a 1/4 mile of buildings and wind, and the night had been cold and still, so perhaps a single gunshot might carry. Perhaps. But she had been at her window facing east, within seconds of the shot, and she had seen nothing move on that road. No horse, no lantern, no figure moving through the dark toward the scene. Hare had been there before it was reported again. She had seen it at the mountain pass, and she was seeing it now, and she understood with the cold precision of someone watching a pattern complete itself, that this was not coincidence and had never been coincidence, and that whatever was coming next had been planned a long time ago by someone who did not intend to leave anything to chance. Hare made his announcement at 8 in the morning, standing in the middle of the main street with the authority of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say and is confident in his audience. Ryder Callahan was being brought in for questioning. The dead man had been identified as a drifter named Cole Pruitt, last known to be working odd jobs in the district. He had been found at the gate of the Callahan property with a single bullet wound. The investigation was ongoing. Citizens were asked to remain calm and to report any relevant information to the sheriff's office. Clara stood on the boardwalk outside the boarding house and listened and watched the crowd. Most people heard it with the careful neutrality of those who have learned that visible opinions are a liability. A few nodded slowly, the nod of people confirming what they had already decided to believe. Cutter Foss stood in the doorway of the silver rail with a coffee cup and an expression that said he was cataloging every face in the street and what it was doing. She went to him after Hare had finished and the crowd had begun to disperse. "The shot was fired from the east," she said quietly. "I was at my window within seconds. No one came up that road before Hare arrived." Cutter looked at his coffee cup. He said nothing for long enough that she thought he was not going to respond. Then he said, "How certain are you?" "Certain enough." He nodded once. "You should write that down," he said. "Date, time, exactly what you saw and didn't see. Keep it somewhere that isn't your room at the boarding house." She looked at him. "Aldridge reports to Voss," he said simply. "Has for years." He went back inside. Clara taught school that morning. She stood in front of 14 children and explained long division and the difference between a simile and a metaphor and when to use a capital letter for the names of rivers and mountains, and she did all of it with the surface competence of someone whose hands know what to do while the mind is somewhere else entirely. Young Josie Crane wrote her name 11 times on her slate and held it up each time with the same concentrated pride, and Clara praised her each time and meant it. And underneath everything she was thinking about timing and distance and the shape of a lie that has been built carefully enough to look like fact. After school, she walked to the edge of town and found a spot behind the livery stable where she could see the eastern road without being easily seen herself, and she sat on an overturned crate and wrote in the back of her lesson planning book everything she had observed. The time she had heard the shot, the direction, how quickly she had reached the window, what she had seen and not seen on the road, the time at the mountain pass when Hare had arrived before he could have been called, the fact that Voss had known her name before she had given it to anyone in Harlow Creek. She wrote it in the small, careful handwriting she used for things that needed to be precisely recorded, and when she was done, she tore the pages out and folded them and put them inside her teaching certificate, which she kept in the bottom of her trunk inside a secondary lining she had sewn herself during the long train journey west. That afternoon, Hare came to the schoolhouse. He waited until the children had gone. She heard his boots on the porch before the door opened, a particular unhurried tread that was its own kind of statement. "Miss Ashwood," he said. "Sheriff." He came in and looked around the room with the survey of a man confirming that everything is where it is supposed to be. Then he sat down in the nearest student chair and rested one forearm on the desk and looked at her with the patient friendliness of someone who has all the time in the world. "Heard you were asking some questions this morning," he said, "about the Pruitt matter." "I wasn't asking questions," she said. "I was talking to Cutter Foss. About the investigation, about what I heard and saw last night." Hare nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss." He tilted his head slightly. "What did you think you saw?" She noticed the word, thought. "A road that was empty," she said. "From the moment the shot was fired until well after you would have needed to travel from your office to the Callahan property." Hare was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The shot woke me at the office, it's true, but I'd ridden out that direction earlier in the evening to check on something. I was closer than you might think." She let it stand as explanation without confirming it. It was possible. It was also convenient in a way that addressed the specific problem she had identified precisely and completely. "I see," she said. He looked at her pleasantly. "You're new here, Miss Ashwood. You're still getting the lay of things, and that's completely understandable. This town has some complicated history and some complicated personalities." He paused. "Ryder Callahan is one of those personalities. I'd hate to see you form an impression of the situation based on an incomplete picture." "I appreciate that," she said. He stood, smoothed his coat, put his hat on with the slight adjustment that was apparently habitual. "You're doing important work here," he said. "The children need a good teacher. The community needs someone they can rely on." He looked at her steadily, the pleasantness still in place but something underneath it that was not pleasant at all. It would be a shame if questions about judgment got in the way of all that. She held his gaze without flinching. "I completely agree," she said. He left. She stood alone in the quiet schoolhouse and let out a breath she had not been aware of holding, and then she sat down at her desk and stared at the chalkboard for a long time. That evening, Ryder came to her. She was in her room at the boarding house when she heard a sound at the window, a sound that did not belong, a particular knock against the glass, two short and one long, that was deliberate enough to be intentional. She opened the window and looked down, and he was standing below in the narrow passage between the boarding house and the building next to it, looking up at her with his hat in his hand. She came downstairs and out the side door. They stood in the passage in the dark. The street sounds were muffled here, the distant noise of the silver rail, a horse somewhere, the wind. He told her what she had already suspected but needed to hear from him. Cole Pruitt had not been a random drifter. Ryder had seen him twice before in the past month, both times near Voss's property, once talking to one of Voss's hired hands. The man had been placed at Ryder's gate and shot by someone who wanted a body at that location, and the most likely candidate for who had pulled the trigger was not someone who would ever be formally accused of it. Hare, she said. Ryder looked at her, or someone Hare directed. She told him what Hare had said to her that afternoon. Ryder listened without expression, but his jaw tightened slightly at the part about judgment. He's going to try to use you, Ryder said, either as a witness to something that makes me look guilty, or as a voice that confirms his version of events to people who might otherwise doubt it. If you're seen to accept his account, it carries more weight coming from someone who has no obvious stake in the outcome. I already told Cutter what I saw. Ryder nodded. Cutter won't talk to Hare, but he can't do much with it alone. She looked at him in the dark. His face was very clear to her by now, the weathered lines of it, the scar along the jaw, the stillness he carried that she had come to understand was not coldness but discipline. The discipline of a man who has learned that certain kinds of stillness keep you alive. Tell me something, she said. The things people say about your past, are any of them true? He was quiet for a moment. Probably, he said. She waited. He leaned against the wall of the building behind him and looked at the strip of sky visible above them, dark blue and very clear after the rain. My name before I came here was Ryder Kane, he said. I used that name in Wichita, Kansas for 4 years. I worked for a man named Harlan Doyle who ran a substantial operation that involved freight theft, extortion, and several things considerably worse. I didn't arrange the worst things, but I knew about them, and I kept records that made them possible, and I told myself for 2 years that there was a line I wasn't crossing, that the line was meaningful, that it mattered where I stood relative to it. He paused. That was not honest reasoning. It was the reasoning of someone who needs to stay in a situation and needs to believe he is still a decent man. She said nothing. In 1878, I went to the federal prosecutor in Wichita and offered him everything I had, every ledger, every name, every location, every date, in exchange for immunity and the ability to leave Kansas under a different name. The prosecutor took the deal. Doyle and 11 members of his organization went to prison. 3 others who were not caught put a price on my head. $500, which was enough money to motivate serious men to look seriously. He looked back at her. I came to Montana, bought the land under Callahan, built something. Tried to believe that the past was far enough behind me that it had become someone else's problem. And Voss found out. Voss has connections in Kansas through his lumber sourcing operation. It took him 2 years of having me as a neighbor before he dug far enough to find the right name. When he did, he came to me with an offer that was also a threat. Sell the land at his price, or the men in Kansas who are still looking for Ryder Kane learn where he is. She felt the full weight of it settle, the complete architecture of the trap. Voss holding the land he wanted in one hand and the threat of a death sentence in the other, and Ryder standing between them, choosing neither. Why didn't you just leave again, she asked. Ryder looked at her. His voice when he answered was very quiet. Because I built something here, he said. Because at some point a man has to decide whether he is going to keep running from what he did or stand somewhere and be accountable for what he is now. Because I am 46 years old and I am tired, and this is the first place in 20 years that felt like it might be worth staying in. She stood in the dark passage and looked at him and felt something shift in the way she understood the situation. Not just the facts of it, but the human weight of it, what it cost a man to say what he had just said to someone he had known for less than 2 weeks. I'm not going to be Voss's witness, she said. I know, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw at the pass. Clara, I need you to tell me what is actually coming, she said. Not the careful version, the real version. He looked at her for a long moment. He's going to take the land, Ryder said, one way or another. If I won't sell, he'll find a legal mechanism to claim it, a fraudulent debt, a contested boundary survey, a criminal conviction that requires asset forfeiture. Men like Hare exist to provide the legal machinery for men like Voss. The dead man at my gate is the beginning of something, not the end. Then we need to do something before he finishes building it. We, he said, yes. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most honest one, the one that was not trying to conceal anything. Get some sleep, he said. I'll come back tomorrow evening. She went inside. She lay in bed with the ceiling above her and the sounds of the town settling into night around her and thought about Kansas and immunity agreements and what it cost a person to testify against the thing they had been part of. She thought about her sister in Ohio and the partial truth she had told the school board in Columbus. She thought about the various forms that standing in front of something takes and how rarely any of them feel heroic from the inside. She was asleep before midnight for the first time since she had arrived. 10 days after the body at the gate, the barn burned. She saw the light from her window at 2 in the morning, an orange glow against the black eastern sky that was too steady and too large to be anything good. She was dressed and out the door before she was fully conscious of deciding to move. Cutter Foss was already at the Silver Rails hitching post, saddling a horse with the swift economy of someone who has done it in the dark before. I see it, he said without turning around. I'm coming. He looked at her then, assessing quickly in the way he had. You ride. Well enough. He got her a horse from the stable, a broad-shouldered roan mare with a calm eye, and they rode east into the dark with the glow ahead of them growing. The barn was fully involved by the time they arrived. Flames 40 feet into the sky, throwing heat that Clara could feel from the gate, the roar of it underneath everything, the structural collapse of the loft audible as a sustained crack that rolled across the open land. 3 of Ryder's 4 outbuildings were burning. The house showed fire damage along the north wall, one section of boards blackened and smoldering, but it was still standing. Ryder was in the yard. He was upright and moving, but she could see even from the gate that something was wrong with the way he was moving. One arm held slightly wrong, his coat torn at the shoulder. 2 of his hired hands were on the ground. The third, a young man named Ellis Drum, was trying to drag the second one toward the house. Clara was off the horse before it stopped moving. She went to the nearest man on the ground, middle-aged, heavy-set, with a wound in his side that was bleeding with the steady seriousness that meant it needed pressure immediately. She looked at what she had available, her coat, her dress. She got out of the coat and pressed it against the wound and leaned her weight into it, and spoke to him quietly, steadily, the way she spoke to the young students when they were frightened. The calm voice that means someone has decided to be in control of the situation, whether or not they feel it. Cutter went to Ryder. She could hear them talking in low, urgent voices behind her. How many, Cutter said, came in from 3 sides. Maybe 16, maybe more. We held the house for 2 hours before they fired the barn. His voice was controlled but rough at the edges, the roughness of someone running on something chemical and temporary. They left when the barn went up. Figured the point was made. Is the point made? A pause. No. She spent the next 2 hours working. Cutter helped her move the injured men into the house, where there was lamplight and water and space to work. She tore her petticoat into strips and used them alongside what she could find in Ryder's kitchen. She cleaned wounds and applied pressure and kept talking to the men she was treating and to Cutter and to Ellis Drum, who was 17 and doing his best not to show how frightened he was. She had never done anything like this before, and she found that it did not matter, that her hands knew what the situation required and did it without needing her to have prior experience, which was either a useful quality she had not known she possessed or the particular grace that emergencies sometimes bestow on people who have no option but to act. Ryder worked beside her. He assessed, directed, made decisions. At one point she became aware that he was favoring his left side in a way that went beyond the arm she had noticed at the gate, a careful avoidance of any movement that required his torso to rotate, which meant ribs cracked or broken. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm functional." That's not the same thing. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is going to continue doing what he is doing regardless of what anyone says and is prepared to let you know that clearly without being unkind about it. She let it go, for now. By 4 in the morning, the barn had burned down to coals. The injured men were as stable as she could make them. Ellis Drum had fallen asleep sitting against the wall. Ryder sat on the floor with his back against the kitchen counter, his coat off, finally allowing her to look at his ribs. 2 broken, she said, pressing carefully along the left side. Maybe 3. She could feel the irregularity under her fingers. "Probably," he said. "You need a doctor. Closest one is in Dillon, half a day's ride, then we send for him in the morning." He looked at her. She did not respond to that. She finished wrapping his ribs with what remained of her petticoat, working carefully and firmly, and he sat through it without making a sound, which told her something about the degree of pain he was in. "Hair send anyone," Cutter said from the doorway. He had come back in from checking the perimeter. "No, you're surprised," Ryder said. "Not even slightly." Cutter sat down on the nearest chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He knew this was coming. Maybe not tonight specifically, but he knew something was coming. He said it as established fact, and neither of them argued. Clara was sitting on the floor across from Ryder, her back against the opposite wall, her ruined dress covered in blood and ash. The lamp on the counter threw a low, warm light that made the destruction around them look almost peaceful. "We need to send for the marshal," she said. Ryder looked at her. "Not Hare," she said. "The territorial marshal." Someone from outside. Ryder was quiet. "We tried something like that 3 months ago," Cutter said. "Word is Voss has connections at the territorial level too. Not sure how deep they go. We have to try," Clara said. "We have witnesses now. 3 men who were here when it happened and can say what they saw. We have the pattern of events. We have the fact that Hare failed to respond. Any marshal worth his position has to at least come and look. And if he comes and Voss has already shaped the story, then we shape it louder," she said. She heard how it sounded. She did not moderate it. Ryder looked at her in the lamplight for a long moment. Something in his expression had changed from the versions she had seen before. It was still that watchfulness, but underneath it something else had come to the surface, the thing you see in a person's face when they have been alone with something very heavy for a long time and someone has just put their hands under it, alongside them. He nodded once. "In the morning," he said. She nodded. They sat in the quiet house with the coals outside going dark and the sky beginning to gray through the east windows, and she thought about what came next with the clarity that exhaustion sometimes brings when the noise of ordinary consideration falls away and you can see the structure of a situation plainly. The structure of this one was clear enough. Voss would report that Ryder's property had suffered an incident of unclear origin. Hare would note that the situation was under investigation. The marshal, if he came at all, would find a plausible story on one side and an accused man with a hidden past on the other. and unless there was something undeniable to put in front of him, the weight of institutional comfort would settle on the side that did not require anyone to do anything difficult. They needed something undeniable. 2 days later, when the marshal's scheduled arrival was confirmed by telegraph, Clara went to see Voss. She had thought about it for those 2 days, had argued it through with herself on every side, had considered the risks with the same methodical attention she gave to lesson plans and school board correspondence, had told herself 3 times that she would not do it, that it was too dangerous, that there had to be another way, had arrived each time at the same conclusion. Ryder did not know she was going. She had told Cutter only that she needed to speak with Voss about the school offer and that she would tell him about it afterward. Cutter had looked at her with the expression of a man who suspects something but has decided to trust the other person's judgment, which was its own form of confidence. Voss's store was quiet at mid-morning. He was in the back, going over ledgers, and he looked up when she came in with the genuine warmth of a man who considers the arrival of exactly what he has been waiting for to be evidence of his own good judgment. "Miss Ashwood," he stood, "come in, please. Can I get you something?" She sat down and looked at him directly and let herself look troubled in the way she actually was troubled, which made it easier. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said. "The school." He settled back into his chair with the patience of someone who has always known this conversation was coming. "I want to accept it," she said. "I've thought about it carefully, and I think it's the right thing for the children and for the community." Voss smiled. "I'm very glad to hear it. But I'm worried," she said, and let the worry show plainly on her face. "About the violence, about what's been happening, about whether this is a stable enough situation to build something long-term in." Voss made a small sympathetic sound. "These are reasonable concerns. I went out to the Callahan property," she said, "after the fire." She watched his face. "I wanted to see for myself." Voss went very still. "I spoke with Mr. Callahan," she said. She delivered this carefully, the way you deliver something that must land exactly right, not too hard, not too soft. "He's frightened. I don't think he'd admit it to most people, but I could see it." She paused. "I told him that the violence was going to continue whether he sold or not, that holding on was costing more than it was worth, that sometimes the sensible thing is to recognize when a fight is already over." She let that settle. "I think I may have gotten through to him. He seemed different when I left than when I arrived." Voss looked at her for a long moment, the stillness of someone processing information against a complex set of calculations. "Different how?" he said. "Quieter," she said. "Resigned, maybe. Like someone who has been arguing with himself for a long time and has finally reached a conclusion." Voss drummed his fingers once against the desk. "That is interesting," he said. "I wanted you to know because," she continued, "if he does decide to sell, I think it needs to happen quickly, before he changes his mind." She looked at him with the expression of someone sharing something in confidence. "He doesn't trust easily. If someone approaches him before he's had a chance to reconsider, while he's still in that place I saw him in, I think he'd be open to a direct conversation." Voss leaned back slightly. The smile had returned, smaller and more real than the social version he usually deployed. "You've been very helpful, Miss Ashwood," he said. "More helpful than I think you perhaps realize." She smiled back. She let warmth into it, and relief. The relief of someone who has made a decision they were uncertain about and is being told it was the right one. "About the school," she said. "Could we perhaps draw up a preliminary arrangement?" Voss produced paper. They spent 20 minutes discussing terms, the salary, the house, the construction timeline. She asked careful questions and raised modest concerns and accepted his reassurances with the calibrated gratitude of someone being won over. When she left, she walked at a normal pace down the boardwalk and around the corner and out of sight of his windows, and then she stood against the wall of the building next to the bank and breathed for a moment, slowly and deliberately, because her hands were shaking and she did not want them to. From inside the store, through the thin wooden wall, she could hear Voss moving, the sound of his chair, then his voice low, talking to someone she could not see. She did not stay long enough to hear what was said. She already knew what was being said. She had done what she had set out to do, and now the clock was running, and there was not much time before whatever Voss set in motion arrived at Ryder's gate. She went to Cutter and told him everything. He listened without expression and then said, "How long do you think we have?" 2 days, she said, "maybe less." He nodded and went to find the others. That evening they set the trap. Ellis Drum rode out to the 2 neighboring properties whose owners had privately told Ryder they would stand with him if it came to a direct confrontation. Cutter sent word to 3 men in town, including the blacksmith, a former army man named Conrad Briley, who had been watching the situation for months with the patience of someone waiting for the moment when intervention becomes necessary rather than premature. Ryder organized the positions at the property, the remnants of the barn wall that provided cover on the east side, the house windows that gave lines of sight to the gate and the main approach, the shed to the north that commanded the back trail. Clara watched him explain it to the assembled group in the lamplight of the kitchen, moving efficiently through what he needed each person to do and where. And she thought about what Della Hartmore had said about her husband and the debt you accumulate to men like Voss. And she thought about her sister in Ohio. And she thought about the 3 seconds in the rain at the mountain pass and what she had known in those seconds without being able to say it yet. He looked up and found her watching him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You know where to be," he said. She nodded. "Back room, loaded rifle. If anyone gets into the house who isn't us, I know." He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said, "for going to Voss, that was." He stopped. He was not a man who finished sentences that involved acknowledgement of something that cost him something. She had come to understand. "It was necessary," she said. "It was brave," he said, and she could hear the precise effort it took him to say it, the honesty of a man who does not say things like that unless he means them exactly. The night was cold and very clear, stars in every direction. The kind of dark that makes the land feel enormous and the people in it feel appropriately small. She went to the back room and sat on the floor with the rifle across her lap and listened to the silence and waited for what was coming. She did not wait long. The sound of horses came from the south first, then from the east, the deliberate sound of men who are not trying to be quiet because they have decided that numbers are their answer to everything. Through the crack under the back room door, she could see the lamp in the kitchen had been extinguished. The house was dark. The yard was dark. Someone outside called out. His voice was rough, carrying. "Easy enough. Nobody needs to get hurt here. You got one more chance to sign the papers and walk away clean." The silence from the house was complete. Then Ryder's voice from somewhere above, calm and flat. "You came to the wrong place tonight." What followed was not organized in the way she had imagined it would be. It was noise and movement and the specific disorientation of trying to understand a situation you cannot see. She heard the shots from the positions outside, controlled and deliberate from Ryder's men, louder and more chaotic from the attackers. She heard shouting. She heard a horse screaming. She heard the heavy thud of someone falling on the porch. 2 men came through the front door. She heard them in the main room, moving fast. Then the back room door came open. The first man saw her immediately. He came at her without hesitation, and she raised the rifle and told him to stop, and he did not stop, and she fired. The recoil was larger than she had anticipated. The sound in the closed space was enormous. The man staggered back against the doorframe and then came again, slower, one hand pressed to his shoulder. She worked the lever the way Ryder had shown her and fired again, and this time he went down. The second man appeared in the doorway with his rifle raised at her. The shot that took him came from behind. He dropped. Ryder stood in the doorway with his pistol still raised, his face very pale in what little light came through the window. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the sounds of the fight outside were diminishing into separate shots and then into silence. "Are you?" she started. He shook his head. "Not me." He crossed the room to the window and looked out. "The sniper," he said quietly, almost to himself. "There'll be one. There always is." He handed her his rifle. Took hers. "The oak tree on the east side," he said. "Third branch from the bottom. He'll wait until the fighting is done and the guard comes down." She could feel him beside her, concentrated in a way that had nothing to do with stillness. "Wait for the flash," he said. His voice had gone to something quieter than a whisper. "Don't rush it. Let him show you where he is." She waited. Outside someone was calling for retreat, horses moving, the creak and crash of men moving through darkness. She held the rifle against her shoulder and looked at the oak tree at the edge of the yard, a dark mass against the slightly less dark sky, and she breathed slowly and waited. The flash came from the third branch, left side, aimed at movement near the ruined barn wall. She swung left of it and fired. Fired again. Fired a third time. A sound from the tree, something large and heavy, falling through branches. Then the silence of something that had been a threat and was no longer. She lowered the rifle. Ryder was not beside her. She turned. He was on the floor behind her, one hand pressed to his left side, lower than the ribs she had wrapped 2 days before. In the thin light from the window, she could see the dark spread of blood across his shirt. She was beside him before she knew she had moved. "How bad?" she said. His voice when he answered was careful, the way voices get careful when the speaker is managing something that requires all available attention. "Bad enough," he said. That was all. She got her hands over the wound and pressed and spoke to him in the calm voice she had used for the injured men 2 nights before. The voice that means someone is managing the situation, and she did not let herself think about anything except the immediate requirements of the next 10 minutes. Cutter came in, looked at the floor, looked at her. "Get the others," she said. "And someone needs to ride for the doctor in Dillon." He was already moving. She stayed on the floor with her hands on the wound and Ryder's eyes on her face, and outside the night was going quiet in the way nights go quiet after violence, the heavy silence of a place where something irreversible has happened, and the world has not yet caught up to what it means. "You got him," Ryder said. His voice was very quiet. "Be still," she said. "The sniper. You got him." I said, "Be still." His hand came up and covered hers, briefly, before the effort became too much and it fell back. She kept the pressure on the wound and breathed evenly and waited for the sound of boots on the porch. And she did not allow herself to think about what she would do if the doctor did not arrive in time, because that was not a thought that was useful to anyone in this particular moment. The lamp came back on in the kitchen. Someone was building up the fire. Outside, Cutter's voice organized now, taking stock of what the night had produced. Marshal Ford was due in Harlow Creek in 2 days. Voss had known he was coming. Whatever story Voss had prepared would be waiting for the marshal when he rode in, polished and consistent and backed by the authority of the man who owned half of everything in the county. She thought about that, kneeling on the floor in the lamplight with her hands over Ryder's wound, and she felt with complete clarity that the question of whether they could tell a truer story than Voss was not a question she was willing to leave unanswered, whatever it cost. The doctor arrived from Dillon at mid-morning, a compact man named Aldous Reeve with steady hands and the unsentimental efficiency of someone who has worked too long in places where sentiment is a luxury. He examined Ryder on the kitchen table, asked 3 precise questions, and went to work without preamble. Clara and Cutter waited on the porch. The morning was cold and very clear, the clarity that comes after violence the same way it comes after storms, the air washed clean and the light sharp on everything. The yard showed what the night had produced. Scorched ground where a torch had been dropped, dark stains in the mud near the gate, the ruined wall of the barn catching the early sun on its blackened timbers. 6 men had not left the property under their own power. 3 were dead. 3 had wounds serious enough to require attention and were being held in the shed under the watch of Conrad Briley, who sat on a crate outside the shed door with a rifle across his knees and the expression of a man who has decided to be somewhere and intends to stay there. Cutter sat on the porch steps and drank coffee and said nothing for a long time. Clara sat beside him and watched the yard and thought about the marshal arriving in 2 days, and what that arrival would mean depending on what had already reached him before he got here. "He's going to be all right," Cutter said finally. It was not a question. "The doctor seems competent," she said. "Reeve's the best in 200 miles. He's seen worse than this." Cutter turned his cup in his hands. "The question is whether all right is enough, whether Ryder can be on his feet and coherent when Ford rides in, or whether Voss gets to shape the entire story before anyone on our side can say a word." Clara looked at the gate. "Voss is going to say this was a dispute between ranchers that got out of hand," she said. "He'll say Ryder provoked it. He'll have documents supporting whatever he needs to support, and Hare will corroborate everything. And the men we have in that shed will say whatever they think saves them from hanging, unless someone gives them a better reason to tell the truth." Cutter was quiet. "We need Ada Monroe," she said. She had been thinking about it since before dawn, turning it over while she kept pressure on the wound and waited for the doctor, and by now it had the settled quality of something decided. The lawyer from Helena. She took McKittrick's case 2 years ago against the Territorial Mining Consortium and won. She works for reasonable rates when she believes in the matter. You know this how. Della Hartmore's brother-in-law used her for a land dispute last spring. Clara looked at him. "Can you get a message to Helena today?" Cutter stood up and went inside without answering, which she had come to understand was his way of saying yes. Dr. Reeve emerged at noon. He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at her with the appraisal of someone deciding how much truth a person can handle. "Bullets out," he said. "Clean entry, no major vessels. He's lost significant blood, and he's going to be in real pain for the next several weeks, but barring infection, he'll recover full function." He paused. "He needs to stay down for at least a week. No riding, no exertion, nothing that puts strain on that side." Clara nodded. "He's asking for you," Reeve said. There was something in his voice that was not quite clinical neutrality, a slight adjustment that suggested he had formed an opinion about the situation that he was choosing not to express. She went in. Ryder was on the kitchen table still, a folded blanket under his head, his color significantly better than it had been in the dark hours of the night, but still far from good. His eyes were open and tracking, which was the main thing. She pulled a chair up beside him. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, which was characteristic enough that she found it steadying. "The men in the shed," he said. His voice was rough but clear. "What's their condition?" "2 will be fine. The 3rd lost a lot of blood, but Reeve thinks he'll keep his arm." She paused. "They're going to be the most important witnesses we have when Ford arrives." Ryder's jaw tightened slightly. "Ford's going to want to know who ordered the attack. The men in the shed can tell him, if they talk." "We're going to give them reason to," she said. He looked at her with the expression that meant he was listening carefully. "They're facing serious charges," she said. "Conspiracy, assault, arson, potentially worse depending on how Ford categorizes the deaths. If they cooperate fully, name Voss explicitly, provide specifics that can be corroborated, they have an argument for reduced charges. If they don't cooperate, they absorb everything." She met his eyes. "Men facing the possibility of hanging make practical calculations when someone explains the calculation clearly. You've thought this through." "I've had time." He was quiet. "Voss will try to reach them before Ford does," he said. "Promise them protection. Tell them cooperation will be punished. Worse than silence. He's done it before. Then we make sure Ford talks to them before Voss gets the opportunity." She folded her hands in her lap. "I've sent for Ada Monroe from Helena. She should arrive by tomorrow evening if she rides hard." Ryder looked at the ceiling. A long, slow breath that made him wince at the end of it. "You're running this," he said. "Someone has to." He looked at her again, and she could see the effort it cost him not to argue. The effort of a man who is accustomed to running his own situation and is lying on a kitchen table unable to move. "I know," she said, before he could say anything. "I know you'd rather it was you, but it's me, and I need you to rest and to trust that I understand what needs doing." A long moment. "I trust you," he said. It was said quietly and without elaboration, and it landed with more weight than longer statements about trust generally carry. She stayed another hour, until he slept. Then she went back to the porch and sat with Cutter and Conrad Briley, who had come up from the shed to join them, and they worked through what needed to happen before Marshal Ford arrived. Ada Monroe rode in the following evening on a gray horse she had clearly pushed hard. Her dark coat rode dusted, and her expression the focused attention of someone who has been briefed and has been thinking about the briefing for 6 hours in the saddle. She was perhaps 40, with sharp, observant eyes and a way of entering a room that suggested she was already measuring it for what it could be made to do. She spent 2 hours with the documents Clara had assembled, the pages from the lesson planning book transcribed clean and dated, Cutter's observations recorded in his precise hand, Della Hartmore's written account of her husband's experience with Voss, the timeline of events from Clara's arrival at the mountain pass to the previous night. Then she spent an hour with the prisoners in the shed. When she came out, her expression had not changed, but there was something in the set of her jaw that had. "The youngest one will talk," she said. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Clara and Cutter. "His name is Harlan Speck. He's 22. He was recruited 3 weeks ago at the saloon in Dillon by a man he knows as Tanner, who works directly for Voss. He was told the job was intimidation only, that nobody was supposed to get badly hurt, that Voss paid well and took care of people who kept quiet." She paused. "He is now aware that the situation has evolved beyond what he was told to expect and that the legal consequences have evolved accordingly. He's willing to give us Tanner's full name, the location where the crew was assembled, and a description of the conversation in which Voss's name was explicitly used." Cutter let out a slow breath. "Is it enough?" Clara asked. "It's a start," Monroe said. "It establishes the connection between Voss and the attack. It gives Ford something to work with beyond one man's word against another's. But Speck's testimony alone won't convict Voss. Voss will say Speck is lying to save himself, and a good defense lawyer will make that argument effectively. We need corroboration. Something independent of the men who were directly involved." "What kind of corroboration?" Monroe looked at her steadily. "Something documentary. Voss is a businessman. Businessmen keep records. The payment to Tanner and his crew came from somewhere, and somewhere there is a record of it. A ledger, a bank withdrawal, a receipt." Cutter was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and put on his coat. "Give me until morning," he said, and went out. Neither Clara nor Monroe asked where he was going, the certainty in his voice when he said it was its own explanation. She sat with Monroe through the evening, going over the structure of the case they were going to make, and Monroe asked precise questions and listened to the answers with a quality of attention that reminded Clara, unexpectedly, of Ryder. The same kind of listening that is actually processing, not waiting for a pause to speak. At one point Monroe said, "How did you end up in the middle of this?" "You came here as a teacher." "I came here as a teacher," Clara said. Monroe looked at her, and Clara thought about Columbus and her sister and the things she had done that had cost her what it had cost her. The partial truth, the deliberate substitution of herself for someone who could not have survived the exposure. "I'm not particularly good at looking away from things," she said, "when I see something that's wrong and can do something about it." Monroe was quiet for a moment, turning her pen in her fingers. "That's a quality that's genuinely useful in certain situations," she said, "and genuinely costly in others." "I know, but you're still here. I'm still here." Monroe nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had suspected. She slept a few hours on a cot Cutter had set up in the schoolroom. At 3 in the morning she heard Ryder moving in the kitchen and got up. He had made it to the table on his own, which represented either significant progress or poor judgment, possibly both. He looked better than he had, color in his face, eyes clear, though the careful way he was sitting told her the ribs and the wound were making themselves known. "You should be in bed," she said. "I've been in bed for a day and a half." He looked at her. "Tell me where we are," she told him. Monroe's assessment of Speck's testimony. The need for documentary corroboration. Cutter's departure. He listened with his hands flat on the table, the posture of someone receiving information and organizing it. "If Cutter is thinking what I think he's thinking," he said carefully, "he's going to the bank. The bank. Voss's accounts are held at Prentice's bank. Aldous Prentice. The man at the dinner." Ryder paused. "Prentice has been skimming from Voss for 3 years. Small amounts, carefully distributed. Voss doesn't know. Cutter does, because Cutter knows everything that happens in this town that involves money and silence." He paused. "If Prentice thinks Voss is going down, and that his own connection to Voss's operation is about to become public scrutiny, he has a very strong incentive to cooperate with anyone who offers him a way to separate himself from what's coming." Clara looked at him. "Cutter's been holding that information," she said, "for a situation where it became necessary." "Yes." Ryder's mouth moved slightly. "He's patient like that." She sat down across from him. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edge, the dark blue that comes just before the gray. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "About tomorrow. About the hearing." He looked at her. "Monroe wants to put your Kansas history into the record," she said, "not to expose you. To establish Voss's motive for trying to force you out." She paused. "If we can show that Voss knew who you were and was using that knowledge as leverage, it reframes everything. It explains why you wouldn't sell, why he needed to escalate, why Hare was complicit." She met his eyes. But it means your real name in the official record. It means people here knowing. Ryder turned to the window, the lightning sky. The immunity agreement, he said. Monroe has confirmed it's still valid. The Doyle prosecution was federal. The record is clear. She kept her voice even. You won't face charges, but people will know. You already knew, he said. I told you myself. Yes. And you're still here. Yes. He was quiet. She did not fill the silence because she had come to understand that his silences were where he actually did his thinking, and interrupting them was a form of discourtesy. Do what you need to do, he said finally. Use whatever helps the case. She nodded. He looked at her, Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name without the prompting of her having insisted on it. It arrived quietly and with considerable weight. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said. Whatever way this goes, I want you to know that the last 2 weeks have been. He stopped. He looked at the table. His jaw moved slightly. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. I'm working on it. I know that, too. He looked up at her. Something in his expression that was not the careful watchfulness she had come to know as his default. Something more open, more uncertain, which on him was its own form of courage. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. They stayed like that until the sky outside went from dark blue to gray, and then she went to check on Monroe, and he stayed at the table because getting up again was going to require considerable effort, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. Cutter came back at 7 in the morning with a ledger book wrapped in canvas and an expression of careful neutrality that was doing considerable work. He sat down with Monroe and Clara and laid the ledger open on the table. Prentice, he said simply. Monroe looked at the pages. Her expression changed. The ledger recorded in the precise double-entry notation of a careful bookkeeper 18 months of payments from a Voss commercial account routed through 3 intermediate instruments to a payee listed as T. Services. The amounts corresponded to dates that aligned with the hiring of Hare, the escalation of pressure on Ryder's property, and a payment made exactly 4 days before the body of Cole Pruitt had appeared at Ryder's gate. A final entry dated 8 days prior showed a transfer of significantly larger amount. The date matched the night of the barn fire. Prentice kept this himself, Monroe said. He kept a copy, Cutter said. In a place that wasn't the bank. He looked at the table. He's been keeping insurance for 2 years. He'll confirm the authenticity in exchange for separation from the conspiracy charges. Monroe closed the ledger carefully, as though it were something that might break if handled without sufficient respect. This is enough, she said. Marshal Ford arrived at 11 that morning, riding a road-dusted black horse and accompanied by 2 deputies who had the efficient bearing of men selected for competence rather than appearance. He was older than Clara had expected from the Telegraph correspondence, perhaps 55, with gray in his beard and the kind of stillness in his face that belongs to people who have spent decades watching other people try to lie to them and have developed a finely calibrated instrument for detecting it. He set up in the town hall because Hare's office was not an option anyone suggested, and Ford did not ask about it, which suggested he already had some picture of the landscape he was riding into. Hare was there when they arrived. He had the surface composure of a man who has prepared for this moment and is confident in his preparation, the smooth civic authority he had displayed throughout, the reasonable accommodating manner of a public servant with nothing to conceal. He shook Ford's hand and offered his office's full cooperation and managed to position himself at Ford's right hand with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that proximity reads as alignment. Ford let him stay there and gave nothing away. The hearing was not a trial. Ford was explicit about that from the beginning. He was here to establish the facts of the incident at the Callahan property and determine whether a formal prosecution was warranted and by whom. He would hear from all relevant parties. He would ask his own questions. He would not be rushed. He questioned Hare first. Hare was fluent and organized. He described the events of the previous weeks as a property dispute that had escalated due to Callahan's intransigence, characterized the barn fire as possibly accidental given the presence of multiple armed and agitated parties, and expressed appropriate official regret about the casualties while making clear that the situation had been complicated and that responsibility was not straightforwardly assignable. He said Callahan's name 11 times in 20 minutes. Ford made notes and thanked him. Then Ford called Clara. She had not expected to go second. She had expected Monroe to structure the presentation more carefully, to build toward her testimony rather than beginning with it. But Ford had his own method, and she understood when he looked at her across the table that he was not interested in presentations. He was interested in people. She told him everything, from the beginning. The accident at the pass and Hare's impossible timing, the dinner at Voss's house and the offer and the specific texture of its conditions, her conversations with Ryder, the night of the barn fire, the trap, the attack, what she had seen and done in the back room of the house, what she had seen from her window the night Cole Pruitt died. She told it without performance, in the plain sequential way she would have told it to her sister, and she watched Ford's face while she told it, and his face gave her almost nothing, which she took as a positive sign because men who are dismissing what they hear do not generally work this hard to conceal it. When she finished, Ford said, "Miss Ashwood, you were aware that your actions on the night of the ambush put you in direct physical danger." "Yes." "And you proceeded anyway?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Why, he said. She had thought about how to answer this question if it was asked. She had composed careful versions of the answer that emphasized civic responsibility and the protection of innocent parties and the absence of other available options. She did not use any of those versions, because it was the right thing to do, she said, and because I have spent enough of my life being careful in ways that mostly protect people who are already protected, and I didn't want to do that anymore. Ford looked at her for another moment. Then he wrote something in his notes. Monroe presented the Speck testimony next, with Speck himself in the room, pale and visibly frightened, giving his account in the flat voice of someone who has made a decision and is not going to undo it. He named Tanner. He named the location in Dillon where the crew had assembled. He described the conversation in which Voss's name had been used specifically and the nature of the instructions that had been given. Hare, sitting against the wall, did not move. His face had gone very still. Then Monroe laid the ledger on the table. She explained its provenance efficiently, Prentice's identity, his willingness to authenticate it, the routing of the payments through intermediate accounts, the dates and amounts and the correspondence to known events. She did not dramatize it. She simply placed it in front of Ford and allowed him to read. The room was very quiet. Ford read for 8 minutes. He turned pages with the methodical attention of a man who reads financial documents professionally and finds them legible in ways that others might not. When he finished, he looked up. "Is Mr. Voss present?" he said. Voss was in the back of the room. He had been there throughout, seated with his lawyer, maintaining the composed authority of a man attending a proceeding that concerns him peripherally. At Ford's words, he stood, and Clara looked at him, and she saw for the first time that the composure was no longer fully intact. It was still there, still doing its work, but underneath it something had changed, something structural. The way a wall looks different when what was holding it up has been quietly removed even before the wall itself begins to fall. "Mr. Voss," Ford said, "I have some questions for you." What followed was 40 minutes that Clara would not describe to anyone afterward in detail, because some things are better left as the simple fact of their occurrence. Voss answered questions. His lawyer objected at intervals. Ford sustained none of the objections. The ledger sat on the table between them like something that had decided to be present and intended to remain so regardless of anyone's preference on the matter. At the end of it, Ford said, "I've heard enough for today. I'll have my determination by tomorrow morning." Hare tried to leave with the crowd. One of Ford's deputies put a hand on his arm and said something quiet that made Hare stop walking. Clara stood on the boardwalk outside the town hall in the thin afternoon light and let herself breathe. Della Hartmore appeared at her elbow. Her face was doing something complicated that resolved after a moment into something simpler and warmer than she usually showed. "My husband is meeting with Monroe right now," she said, "about the mill, about what his options are if Voss's properties get seized." Clara looked at her. "He's been waiting for this for 2 years, Della said quietly, waiting to see if it was actually possible. She paused. "Thank you." Clara nodded. She did not trust herself to say anything adequate, so she said nothing, and Della seemed to understand. The determination came the following morning. Ford read it standing, in the same town hall, with fewer people present than the day before, but with the attention in the room that belongs to moments that will be referred to later. The attack on the Callahan property was determined to be a coordinated criminal act organized by Edmund Voss and executed with the knowledge and cooperation of Sheriff Dalton Hare. The evidence was sufficient to proceed to formal prosecution on charges including conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit assault, and in the case of Cole Pruitt's death, conspiracy to commit murder. Both Voss and Hare were to be remanded to territorial custody immediately pending trial in Helena. Regarding Ryder Callahan, no charges were being brought. The defense of his property had been found legally justified under the circumstances. Ford paused at the end of the formal language and looked up. "One additional matter," he said. He looked at Ryder, who had made it to the hearing on his feet, moving carefully with Clara on his left side and Cutter on his right. Regarding the identity question that arose in testimony, he opened a separate document. "I contacted the federal prosecutor's office in Wichita by telegraph yesterday evening. The immunity agreement entered into by Ryder Kane in 1878 remains fully valid and on record. Furthermore, the organization against which that testimony was given has been dissolved. Its leadership has been incarcerated or deceased. Any outstanding private arrangements associated with that organization are no longer operative." He looked at Ryder directly. "For what it is worth, Mr. Kane, the prosecutor's office asked me to convey that the testimony you gave in 1878 resulted in the conviction of 11 individuals and the recovery of assets stolen from over 30 families." He folded the document. "That is the official record." The room was quiet. Ryder said nothing. His jaw was tight and his eyes were on the middle distance, and Clara, standing beside him, felt the look of a man receiving something he had not expected and did not quite know how to hold. She put her hand through his arm. He looked at her. She said nothing. She did not need to. Voss was led to the door with 2 of Ford's deputies. He stood for a moment before they reached it, his hands being secured, and Clara watched him make the calculations she suspected he had been running since Monroe laid the ledger on the table, whether there was anything left to say that would matter. He decided there wasn't. He passed within 6 feet of her on his way out and kept his eyes forward, which was the last form of control available to him and therefore the one he chose. Hare was escorted separately. He was white-faced and very still, all the practiced authority stripped away, and what was underneath it was smaller than she had expected. Outside, the afternoon had gone golden with the late autumn light that turns everything briefly beautiful before the cold closes in. Cutter was on the boardwalk with a bottle and 4 cups. He poured without ceremony and handed them around. Conrad Briley raised his cup. To people who stand when they could walk away, he said. They drank. Clara stood in the afternoon sun and looked at Harlow Creek, at the main street and the buildings and the people coming out onto the boardwalk to find out what had happened, and she felt something she had not expected, which was not triumph exactly, not the clean satisfaction of a problem solved, but something quieter and more complex. The feeling of having been in a place for a short time and already knowing it in the way that means it has gotten into you, that its shape is now part of your interior landscape whether you stay or go. She was going to stay. She had known it before this morning. Had known it for longer than she had admitted to herself, the way you know certain things before you have organized the language for them. Ryder found her an hour later at the edge of the eastern road where she had walked to think. The light was going orange and the grassland was gold in it, and the mountains to the west were going dark blue. He walked slowly, still carefully, but without the rigid management of pain she had seen the day before. He stopped beside her and looked east. Ford told me something else, he said, after the official reading. He said the territorial governor is going to appoint an interim sheriff from outside the county. Someone who doesn't owe anything to anyone here. Good, she said. Della's husband is organizing a meeting of the people Voss held notes on, to figure out what the debts actually are and whether they're legitimate. Monroe is staying to help. Also good. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need to ask you something. She waited. I've been thinking about what I said to you early on, that you should leave before it got complicated. He paused. I was trying to protect you, but I think I was also. He stopped. He started again. I've been doing things alone for a long time, making decisions alone. It's a habit that gets hard to break even when breaking it would be the right thing. He looked at her. I'm telling you because I want to be honest about it. About the fact that I'm not naturally good at including people in things. And that I'm aware of that and intend to work on it. Clara looked at him. That is the most words I've heard you say at one time, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. I've been working up to it. She turned to face him fully. The light was very good on his face right now. The weathered lines of it, the scar along the jaw, the pale eyes that she had spent 2 weeks learning to read. I'll tell you something in return, she said. I came here running from something, a situation in Ohio that I handled in a way that cost me what it cost me, and that I don't regret, but that I was tired of carrying by myself. She paused. I wasn't planning to tell anyone here about it. I was going to be the new teacher, with the clean record and the unknown past, and start over as a version of myself that didn't have that weight on it. She looked at him steadily. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want a version of myself that doesn't include what I've actually done and been. I want the whole thing, even the parts that are heavy. Ryder looked at her for a long moment. What happened in Ohio, he said. She told him. All of it. Her sister and the mistake and the partial truth she had told and what it had cost her, the position, the reputation, the people who had chosen distance. She told it plainly in the same way she had told Ford about the mountain pass, sequential and unembellished. When she finished, he said, You took the consequence that belonged to someone else. Yes, because she couldn't have survived it. She would have been destroyed by it, yes. He was quiet, looking at the mountains. I understand that, he said. The logic of it. He looked back at her. I also think you were allowed to tell me sooner. I know. You didn't have to wait until. I know. She met his eyes. I was still deciding how much to trust. And now, she smiled slightly. I stood in the back room of your house and shot 2 men and spent the night with my hands on your wound. I think we're past the question of trust. He looked at her, and the openness she had seen in his face in the early morning at the kitchen table was there again, more clearly now, the honesty of a man who has stopped managing his expression. He reached into his coat pocket. He took out something small and held it out to her. It was a ring, silver plain with a small pale stone that caught the evening light and held it briefly before letting it go, simple as a fact stated plainly. I had it made in Dillon when I went for supplies 2 weeks ago, he said. Before most of this happened, before I had any reasonable grounds for thinking. He stopped. He looked at the ring in his palm. It was presumptuous. He looked up at her, and I'd rather be honest about it than pretend I didn't do it. She looked at the ring, then at his face, then at the ring again. 2 weeks, she said. He said nothing. You'd known me for 2 weeks. Less than that. She shook her head slowly. A man who doesn't talk to anyone in town for 3 years. I know how it looks. It looks like you made a decision very quickly for someone who makes decisions very slowly. He looked at her with perfect seriousness. It wasn't quick, he said. I've been making this decision my whole life. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until the coach went over at the pass. The mountains behind him had gone dark. The first star was out. The grassland in the long evening light was that particular gold that does not last, but that you remember long after it is gone. She took the ring from his palm. Yes, she said. He let out a breath that he had been holding, she suspected, for considerably longer than the last few minutes. She put the ring on and looked at it in the evening light, the simple silver circle on her finger, and felt the particular solidity of a thing that has been decided and cannot be undecided. The ring was cold from being in his pocket, and it warmed on her finger in the evening air, and that seemed like the right way for things to start. They were married 6 weeks later in the new schoolhouse, because it was the largest building in Harlow Creek, and the only one that did not carry Voss's fingerprints anywhere on its lumber. Della Hartmore stood with Clara. Cutter stood with Ryder. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who came through every other month, a deliberate man who read the words as though he meant them and did not add anything superfluous, which suited everyone present. The whole town came, or near enough to it that the distinction did not matter. The children had decorated the schoolhouse with paper and dried wildflowers, and young Josie Crane presented Clara with a card, on which she had written her own name 15 times in careful letters, and then at the bottom, in larger and less careful letters, Miss Clara, which was what the children called her, and apparently intended to continue calling her regardless of the change in her last name. There was food enough for twice the number of people, and a fiddle player from the Whitfield Hotel, and dancing in the street until the cold drove people inside. Cutter produced a bottle of something he had been saving for an occasion he had not previously specified, and it turned out to be more than adequate. Conrad Briley danced 3 times and knocked over a lantern once. Ellis Drum, who had turned 18 the previous week, danced with systematic enthusiasm that suggested he was working through a project. Della and her husband John stood together against the schoolhouse wall, watching the street with the look of people who have come out the other side of something and are still adjusting to what the light looks like from here. Clara and Ryder left before it was over, quietly without announcement, the way you leave things that are proceeding perfectly well without you. They rode out to the property in the dark. The house showed its winter face, warm-windowed against the cold, the repaired porch still pale with new lumber. The barn was aframe again, the skeleton of what it would become in spring when the weather broke and the work could begin in earnest. They stood on the porch. The night was enormous and very clear and cold enough that their breath came white in the lamplight spilling from the window. She looked at the land, the rolling dark of the grassland, the mountains a deeper dark against the sky. The creek she could hear but not see, running cold and steady over its stones in the dark below the house. "This is the water source," she said, "that Voss wanted." Ryder stood beside her. Yes, she looked at it. It was not spectacular. It was not the kind of thing that announced itself as worth fighting over. It was just water, moving in the dark, patient and consistent, the way water is. "Worth it," she said. Not a question. Ryder was quiet for a moment. "Worth it," he said. She leaned against him slightly, carefully, mindful of the healing side, and he put his arm around her with the same care, and they stood in the cold and looked at the land that was theirs, and at the dark and the stars above it. Winter came in hard that year and stayed. The cold settled into the valley in December and did not let go until March, and in that time Clara and Ryder learned each other in the way that people learn each other when the weather keeps them close and the work keeps them honest. She learned that he woke before dawn without an alarm and started coffee before she was conscious. He learned that she could not be spoken to for the first 20 minutes of the morning and did not require explanation for this. She learned that his silences were organized by type and that she could distinguish between them. He learned that her stubbornness was not a performance and could not be reasoned with and was better accepted than contested. The letter from Columbus arrived in early spring. It was from her sister, 2 pages in the familiar handwriting, full of the ordinary detail of a life proceeding normally. Her sister's children were well. The elder was reading ahead of his grade. There was a new neighbor who kept too many dogs. At the end, in a different tone, her sister said that she had never properly said what needed saying, that she understood now what Clara had done and what it had cost, and that she was sorry for the years it had taken her to understand it fully, and that she hoped Montana was everything it needed to be. Clara wrote back the same day. She told her sister about the school and the children and the winter, which had been hard but navigable. She told her about Ryder, who was recovering well and had taken on 2 additional ranch hands in anticipation of spring expansion, and who was, she said, not the easiest person in the world to live with due to a constitutional preference for silence and an occasional inability to ask for help, but that these were qualities she recognized and understood and was prepared to negotiate with indefinitely. She did not tell her sister about the night of the attack or the back room or the things she had done in the dark with the rifle. That was not a story for a letter. That was a story for a winter evening by a fire, when there was time to tell it fully and to let it be what it actually was, which was not a story about violence, but a story about what a person discovers about themselves when the ordinary protections of a normal life are removed and they have to find out what is underneath. She sealed the letter and walked it to the post office in the bright, cold morning, passing the schoolhouse where she could hear the children inside already, the productive noise of young people applying themselves to something that matters. At the end of April, Ryder found her reading on the porch in the last of the afternoon light, which had turned warm enough to sit in for the first time since October. He sat down beside her and was quiet for a while in the comfortable way he was quiet now, the silence that had become a form of company rather than a form of distance. After a while he said, Ford wrote, about the Helena trial. She looked at him. Voss pled at the last moment, he said, to avoid the full trial. Guilty on the conspiracy charges, 15 years minimum. He paused. Hare took the stand against him in exchange for a reduced sentence, 5 years. She nodded. It was the right outcome, she said. Not a perfect one. No, but right. He looked at the mountains. The light on them at this hour was something she had spent the winter learning to watch for, the particular way the peaks held the last of the afternoon gold before the color went out of everything. I got something else in the mail, he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it. It was from the federal prosecutor's office in Wichita, a formal notification confirming the permanent closure of all proceedings related to the Doyle Organization prosecution. It confirmed the validity and permanence of the 1878 immunity agreement. At the bottom, in a handwritten addendum, the prosecutor had written 2 sentences. The testimony given in this matter required considerable personal courage at considerable personal cost. The record reflects this clearly. She refolded it carefully and gave it back to him. He looked at it in his hands. 5 years ago, I would have thought this piece of paper could fix something, he said. He folded it again. It doesn't fix anything, but it's the right ending to a part of the story. She reached over and put her hand over his, the way she had in the early morning at the kitchen table when the sky was just beginning to lighten. And they sat together on the porch in the last of the April sun while the light went slowly from gold to gray and the mountains settled into their evening shapes against the sky. Inside, the house was warm. The books she had ordered for next year's school term had arrived the previous week and were stacked in the parlor waiting to be sorted. Ryder's account books were on the desk, the figures for the spring cattle purchases laid out in his careful handwriting, the small things of a life organized around a future rather than a flight from a past. She had come here running. She had found something she did not know she was looking for, which is the only way you find certain things. She had stood in a street and in a back room and in a courtroom and on a porch in the rain, and she had chosen each time not to walk away, and each time the choice had been the one she would make again, which is the clearest test of whether a decision was right. The creek ran in the dark below the house. The water that had started all of this, ordinary and essential and older than any of the claims made on it. It ran now as it had run before Voss and before Ryder and before any of the human arrangements that had nearly destroyed what was here, and it would run long after, patient and cold and completely indifferent to what people decided about it, which was in its own way a form of comfort. She leaned her head back and looked at the first stars coming out. The same stars that had been over the Montana Pass the night the coach went over. And a man she had never seen before pulled her out of the wreck and looked at her for 3 seconds in the rain, and then looked away. She thought about those 3 seconds sometimes. How they had contained, without either of them knowing it, every decision that would come after. How the most important things in a life often arrive looking like nothing in particular. A stopped coach, a man in the rain, a moment of being seen clearly by someone who is very good at seeing. Ryder sat beside her and was quiet, and the quiet was the kind that does not need to be filled. The kind that has earned its peace, the kind that belongs to 2 people who have stopped running and found, in the stopping, that what they were looking for had been waiting for them to stand still long enough to see it. The stars came out one by one over the Montana grassland. The creek ran over its stones. The house behind them held its warmth against the cold. And on the porch, in the last of the light, 2 people who had each carried something heavy for a very long time sat together with nothing between them and the wide, dark sky, and were, for the first time in longer than either of them could precisely remember, entirely at rest.